All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. This is our first event in our SEL Speaker Series, and we're super excited to have so many of you here, not only registered, but also so many people live. We have 32 people here live. So thank you for spending some of your time on a Tuesday evening with us. My name is Amber Colvin, and I'm the director of Lausanne Learning. We are a nonprofit here in Memphis that is focused on empowering educators and also on promoting lifelong learning for everyone. So we're based at Lausanne Collegiate School, where Greg is the director of social emotional learning. Greg, I'll let you introduce yourself real quickly.
Hello, I'm Greg Graber. I hope everybody is doing well. We are delighted to be here for our first, this is our very first one that we've ever done, and we're looking forward to it. And you're going to love seeing Jonathan speak. He is dynamic. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm just going to do a couple of quick housekeeping things as we get started today. So first, and knock on wood, we haven't had any of these kind of issues in our many online events last year and this year so far. But if there's any kind of major tech issue or a Zoom security issue, we will just kind of immediately shut this one down. We'll send you a link for a new Zoom meeting and we'll just continue on. Again, that hasn't happened, but it's always good to know kind of what's going to go on. If you do have any tech issues or need anything, I'll be in the chat. Greg will be in the chat as well. We've got a couple other people moderating. Feel free to put those in there. Second, we do ask that you stay muted unless asked to unmute, like during the Q&A. We love you. We love your lovely voices and your faces, but we want to try to cut down on background noise. I have 3 large dogs and a 12-year-old, so I will stay muted quite a bit. Finally, we're also going to I'm going to put in the chat a bunch of links for you to our upcoming speakers, to Jonathan Mooney's books, to a bunch of different things. Those will also be available when I send the video out. So feel free to click on them and keep it open in your million tabs if you're like me, or I'll send it out with the video, which I will try to get out to you definitely by the end of this week. So that'll be for everyone who wants to rewatch and for everyone who couldn't attend live tonight. So with that, I wanted to introduce our speaker to you. We've got Jonathan Mooney. He is a neurodiversity expert. He's an author. He's written several books, The Short Bus, Learning Outside the Lines, and his newest book, Normal Sucks, How to Live, Learn, and Thrive Outside the Lines. He's also an activist. He's a highly sought out speaker, and we are super excited to have him here tonight. He's going to talk for a little while. We will ask some questions and then we'll open it up for a few questions from you in the chat, or if you want to say them out loud. I'm excited to have you here. Jonathan, I'll let you take it away. And I'm going to unshare my screen and feel free to share whatever you would like.
Okay, well, thank you all so very much for being here. My name is Jonathan Mooney, and before I begin, I have just a few pieces of housekeeping on my own side here. First and foremost, I want to give you all a sense of how I'd like to spend our time together. I read recently that the average human attention span is about 15 minutes. And then I read that the average attention span on a Tuesday evening on a Zoom conference is about 15 seconds. So I want to assure you that I'm going to keep my talking at you down to a manageable minimum and make sure that we have ample time to talk together, as mentioned, in the form of questions, conversation, and dialogue. So I hope that sounds like an okay way to spend a Tuesday evening together. Okay, second piece of housekeeping. Want to give a big old shout out to the hosts of this evening, Lausanne Learning Center and Collegiate School. I'm celebrating this year my 20th anniversary as a activist on behalf of folks who learn differently. And in celebration of 20 years of doing this work, and in recognition of the work still to be done, I put out a call to anyone and everyone who was on a shared mission with me to host a presentation around neurodiversity and learning differences, free of cost for everyone involved. And Louisiana Learning was one of those people around the country who answered that call to action. And they're folks working every day to make sure that we have schools and a world that don't just work for some people, but ultimately work for all people. And that's important work. So in whatever way you can, I ask you to celebrate them, send some clapping hand emojis or some firework or something like that. But whoever you are and wherever you are, let's celebrate the work of these folks on the ground in Tennessee, making a difference in the lives of young people. Okay, so with all that said and done, let me get right to it. I was asked here this evening to share two things with you. On one hand, I was asked to share with you my professional experience of working with and advocating for young people who learn differently. And as I mentioned, that's pretty much all I've ever done in my professional life. So I was asked to share what I've learned in that 20-year journey, what I know makes a difference in the lives of young kids who learn outside the lines. But I was also asked here this evening to share something more important with you than my professional work, and that's my personal experience of being somebody who learns differently. Because everything I've done on behalf of kids who learn outside the lines comes directly from my experience of being one of those kids. I was one of those kids who had such a hard time sitting still that I spent most of the day chilling out with the janitor in the hallway. I was one of those kids in middle school who had such a hard time keeping his mouth shut that I grew up on a first name basis with Shirley, the receptionist, in the principal's office. And in high school, I was one of those kids who had such a hard time with reading, and specifically a torturous time reading out loud, that I spent most of my high school experience hiding in the bathroom to escape reading out loud with tears streaming down my face. Y'all know I did not learn to read until I was 12. I couldn't read until I was 12. Growing up, I had every label you could imagine. I was called the bad kid. I was called the lazy kid. I was called the at-risk kid. And eventually I became the special ed kid. I was diagnosed with a continuum of language-based learning differences, dyslexia, dysgraphia, and others in third grade. I was diagnosed with a whole bunch of behavioral and attentional disorders, ADHD and others, in fourth grade. And I dropped out of school for about a year in sixth grade. That year when I left school, I struggled with a number of mental health challenges. I struggled with anxiety, I struggled with depression, and I had a plan for suicide. So y'all can imagine, by the time I got back into middle school and beyond, I faced all sorts of low expectations that too often surround young people who don't fit our definition of the normal or right learner. I heard it all. I was told by my father that I'd most likely end up being a high school dropout. I was told by a counselor at one point that I'd most likely end up flipping burgers for a living. And then I was told my senior year in high school that I'd most likely end up in jail. So I was asked here this evening to talk about how I transcended those low expectations, how I went on a very different journey than the one predicted for me. Opposed to being a high school dropout, I became a college graduate. I graduated from a place called Brown University, which you may or may not know is an Ivy League university with an honors degree in, of all things, English literature. Opposed to flipping burgers, I ended up writing books. First book I wrote as an undergraduate at Brown University. And most importantly, opposed to being an inmate, I became an advocate, somebody who has dedicated his entire life to making the world a better place for folks who get the short end of the stick. So I want to share that journey of change with you today. I want to talk about what put me on a path of healing and ultimately a path of thriving. And I want to talk about my journey, not just as it pertains to me, but as it pertains to those 1 in 5 and beyond young people who learn and live differently, young folks with atypical brains and bodies, because it is an all hands on deck moment for us to make a difference in those kids who spend the day chilling out with the janitor in the hallway, grow up feeling stupid, crazy, and lazy. So when I think about my own journey, but more importantly, when I think about the research literature and what we know puts young folks on a different path, there are 3 things. I want to share these 3 things with you tonight for about 25 more minutes at most. And then I want to open it up so we can talk together. So let me get right to it. First and foremost, a journey of empowerment for young folks with neurodiversities begins when we, as parents, as educators, and ultimately when we as a society redefine who or what we call the problem. For most of human history, we have called normal good and right, and different deficient and wrong. If you deviate from that middle of the bell curve, you are told that you are the problem. We put the problem in the person, and we turn what are in reality human differences into deficits and disorders inside of that person. And change for kids like me can only happen when we reject that and redefine the problem. Redefine the problem as not the difference, but ultimately the way the difference is treated by environments that value the myth that we should all be the same. Now, I know I just said a lot at you, so let me use my life experience as a way to illuminate that paradigm shift of what we call the problem. In my life, I was told that my problem was ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Hang out with those words. Those words imply that something is wrong with my brain. But the reality is that this thing everybody called a deficit or a disorder was in reality a difference in the truest sense of that term. Now, it's a difference with challenges. I know that. I'm not in denial about the challenges that come with having my brain. Y'all know I struggle with paying attention to this day. I have the attention span of a gnat. I struggle with executive functioning. I have explored the feasibility of stapling my car keys to my forehead. Okay, I got that right. Those are very real challenges and limitations. But what goes hand in hand with those very real challenges and limitations is a whole bunch of very real strengths, gifts, and talents that we don't talk enough about. Y'all know that folks with atypical attention spans are often better problem solvers than the general population. I came across a research article recently about EMTs, emergency medical professionals, firemen and women with ADD. And this research article showed that firemen and women, paramedics with ADD are better at their job than so-called normal EMTs. That makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, your house is on fire. You want that dude to have ADD, right? Forget paying attention. Come get my cat, So it is a difference with good things about it, with challenges about it. It is not, however, my problem. My problem is the way the difference is treated. My problem is the school desk. How in God's name could a school desk be a kid's problem? Well, let me immerse you into my relationship with the school desk, and it is a fraught relationship, right? This is my experience at that school desk in first grade, in 8th grade, in 12th grade, in college, tonight, sitting here. This is how it goes down, right? I see that desk, I see that chair, and before I even sit in it, my hands start to sweat. My face gets all red because I know after 5 seconds at that desk, my foot's going to start bouncing. 10 seconds at the desk, both feet start bouncing. 15 seconds at the desk, oh, I'm going to bust out the drums. 15 minutes at the desk, oh, it is all over. I'm the kid trying to take his leg and put it behind his neck, right? And that young person is shamed for that behavior. I know I was shamed at home. I grew up in a good old school Irish Catholic household. So every night at the dinner table, it was, Jonathan, stop it, stop it, stop it. What is wrong with you? From my father. And I got the same message in some of my classrooms. Not all of my classrooms, don't get me wrong, but some of them. I'll never forget. I had a teacher in 2nd grade named Mrs. C. I've had many, many gifted, brilliant teachers in my life who I will celebrate with you tonight. Mrs. C is not one of those, okay? My foot would be bouncing. She would stop class. She would point at me and she would say at the top of her lungs, Jonathan, what is your problem? You see, we put the problem in the person and we make different deficient. But the reality is the problem wasn't in me. The problem wasn't my ADD. The problem was a passive learning environment that confused or conflated being the good kid with being the compliant kid. And the problem was ultimately the sense of shame and social stigma that comes from being publicly identified as the problem. That's really the problem. It's not in the person, but in the way the difference is treated in an environment built for the myth that we should be all the same. And the same is true with my so-called learning disabilities. I'm sure you all know that the vast majority of young folks receiving special education services in public schools across America are receiving those services for specific language-based learning disabilities. And again, those words imply that something's wrong with these children's brains. But the reality is dyslexia and dysgraphia are learning differences in the truest sense of that term. Now, again, I'm not naive about the challenges that come with having my learning differences. You know, I struggle with spelling. I spell at a 3rd grade level to this day. I struggle with reading. I confuse words that look alike, who and how, horse and house. I swear to you, when I went to Brown University, I thought the university offered a course in orgasmic chemistry. Okay. Now imagine my disappointment on the first day of that class, right? I got that. Those are very real challenges and limitations that are neurobiologically based. But what goes hand in hand with those very real limitations are a whole bunch of very real good things that we don't talk enough about. Hey, do y'all know that over 50% of small businesses in America, the engine of our economy, over 50% of small businesses are founded by or run by somebody with a language-based learning difference. So it is a difference. It was not my problem. My problem was being made to feel stupid because of my difference. That is really the problem. And I'll tell you, we got a national crisis on our hands of young folks leaving school feeling dumb. You know, I spent a lot of time talking to incarcerated youth. And every time I talk to those young folks, and I ask them to describe themselves, whether it's white kids, whether it's Black and brown young folks, whether it's in the South, in the West, in the East, doesn't matter. Every time I ask those kids to describe themselves, at some point they will say, I am stupid. They got the message that their differences made them defective and that they were dumb. And that wounded them deeply. And that crisis, that message has an origin. And the origin is a narrow definition in our culture that gets institutionalized in our schools of what constitutes intelligence. We confuse or conflate being smart with being good at school. But don't know about y'all, some of the smartest people I have ever met in my life, they didn't do school well. They didn't read well or write well, but guess what? They could rebuild the car engine from scratch. And that person is just as intelligent, just as valuable as that person with a PhD. And the flip side is true. Some of the stupidest people I've ever met have had PhDs, can't get to the supermarket, you know? We have elevated one brain at the expense of all those other brains. And we've institutionalized that definition of intelligence. And then we start to track kids based on it. Don't know if y'all remember tracking from your education, right? Now, I'll say that differently. I'm sure some of y'all out there remember reading groups, right? Let me ask you a question about those reading groups. Was it ever hard to tell which reading group was the smart group and which reading group was the dumb group? Not hard to tell, you know? You got the blackbirds over here, you got the bluebirds over here, and then over in the annexed trailer building, you got the sparrows, you know? Come on now. Nobody was fooled, were they? Let me put it this way. When I was growing up, everybody knew that my group was the dumb group because my group was a bird that did not fly, okay? It was an ostrich and it ran quickly, you know? And I grew up chilling out with C Spot Run. And everybody knew that the condors were the smart group because the condors were reading War and Peace. We've all been acculturated into a narrow definition of what constitutes intelligence. We know what gets you in the smart group, don't we? And it ain't your tactile kinesthetic intelligence. It's not your social emotional IQ. It's not whether you can draw or build or talk or care or connect. It's a narrow band of academic skills that we have prioritized, elevated above everything else. And that is wrong. And that, not learning differences, is the problem. So the problem's not in the kid. The problem's not with these differences. The problem is in an institutionalized ableism that privileges some brains and bodies over others. And the problem is ultimately the shame and stigma that comes from being made to feel deficient, from being made to feel stupid, crazy, and lazy. That's the problem. And it is imperative that we name the problem correctly, because for too long, we put the problem in the person. And that leads us down a particular road of calling different deficient and then trying to fix these so-called deficiencies. But when we reframe the problem, we can think differently about kids who learn differently, but more importantly, we can act differently. And that brings me to the second thing I want to share with you tonight that I know makes a difference in the lives of kids who are different. The second idea for me is logically stemming from this reframing of the problem. Because as I mentioned, when we think of the problem as in the kid, we try to fix the kid. We try to make the round peg fit the square hole. But the problem is when we make the peg fit the hole too much, eventually the peg breaks. And the person loses their sense of self and efficacy and sees themselves as deficient and less than. In my life, I'm here today because of people who challenged that square peg fit in the round hole and demanded that the context around me change, not the learner. You know, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for my mom, right? Give you a mental image of Colleen Mooney, you know? A lot of folks underestimated my mom, right? My mom, not a tall woman. On a good day, in high heels, on her tippy toes, my mom is 4'11", you know, little Irish bulldog, right? And my mom, she's got this very funny, high-pitched voice. She totally sounds like Minnie Mouse. And my mom, she is also somebody who curses like a truck driver. So let me ask you a question. If you were a principal or a teacher, did you want cursing Minnie Mouse in your office? The answer to that question, if you are at all confused, is no. But guess where my mom was every single day when things were going wrong for her son? Oh, she was in that office. How did we know she was in that office? Well, we knew she was in that office because every dog in the neighborhood was running away. Only bats could hear her high-pitched obscenities. Glass was shattering. My mother understood something, you know. She understood that I didn't need somebody in my life to fix me. What I needed in my life was somebody to fight for and with me. Somebody in my corner to fight for my right to learn differently. You know, my mom would say to anyone who would listen, she would say, if my son doesn't learn the way he's taught, well, guess what? Teach the way he learns. Now, admittedly, that's a paraphrase because when my mom said it, there were a whole bunch of F-bombs in there that I left out, right? But my mom fought for the environment to change and not the kid. And that's what we need more than ever. You know, so many young folks are the round peg being made to fit the square hole, and they are breaking. And it's not just young folks with neurodiversities. We know gifted young folks fail out of school as much as young folks with special needs. We know that so-called good students are just doing school and are suffering mental health crises every single day. We need to change the context around students. So what does that mean? Well, it means, first of all, we need to fight for young folks' rights for services, you know. Hey, if you read in the 12th percentile and your brain wasn't neurobiologically wired for reading, you need more reading instruction than the kid who gets it easy. Fair doesn't mean equal, and we should be advocates for young people's rights for specialized services in every educational setting, public and private. But, you know, we got to go beyond just fighting for services. And we have to fight for young people's rights for accommodations. You know, the idea of an accommodation comes from the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it's a pretty radical idea. It's not the person that should change, but the environment that should change to create access, to build literal and metaphoric ramps of opportunity for people who have been left behind. You know, I'm here because of a number of accommodations. I'm here because of the accommodation of text to speech. You know, in my day, it was books on tape, right? The thing was so big, you had to put it into a backpack and plug it into a generator. And then you had Stephen Hawking in your ear all day long, right? Nowadays, we got the world's libraries in our pockets on our phones. And the research shows that listening activates the same brain pathways as reading. Let's create access through accommodation. You know, I'm here because of the accommodation of speech to text. You know, back in my day, it was my mom writing things down, and we were both accused of cheating all the time. Nowadays, we have software in our phones. I dictated half or more of my last book walking around my neighborhood into my iPhone. That is something that creates an opportunity for a young person to show what they know. We need accommodations on assessment. You know, one of the most common is time extensions on exams. And you know what? That matters, right? Because when we give a timed exam for a kid like me, we're not assessing how well I know something. We are assessing how fast I know it. And why should how fast I know it be more important than how well I know it? Are we trying to educate a generation of Jeopardy contestants? We need to expand access by assessing kids differently. But ultimately, I'll be real with you. We got to go beyond accommodations just for the neurodiverse, because accommodation has a little bit of a negative connotation to it, doesn't it? It's kind of like that word tolerance, you know? We tolerate something that we don't like all that much, right? Let me put it this way. You know, in the past, when my mother-in-law came to visit, I didn't celebrate her visit. I accommodated her visit, right? We need to go beyond accommodation. And we need to be advocating for universal design of instruction. You know, we have built our approach to education around the myth of the normal learner. But the reality is there is no such thing. The only normal people are people you don't know very well. Difference, learning diversity is paradoxically the norm that we should be designing places of work, our communities, and our schools around. The bold idea that we have an ethical and moral obligation to make sure that education doesn't just work for some kids, but ultimately works for all kids. We have an ethical obligation not to make the square peg fit the round hole, but to change the context around students to include more and more types of learners. Okay, I got one more for you, right? You know, I told you there are three things that I know makes a difference in the lives of the neurodiverse. You know, number one, redefine the problem. Different isn't deficient. Number two, don't change the person, change the context. Be advocates for specialized services, be advocates for accommodation, but ultimately be advocates for universal design of instruction, grounded in the reality of learning diversity for all. And last but not least, empowerment, healing, and thriving for young folks who learn outside the lines can only happen if we challenge the deficit model that surrounds them. You know, if you're a kid like me, if you're a young person that doesn't fit school, you hear a lot about what's wrong with you. You know, Jonathan can't sit still, Jonathan can't spell, Jonathan can't write, Jonathan can't. But you don't hear a lot about what is right with you. And that deficit orientation, focusing on what's wrong and not what is right, is institutionalized in our processes and procedures, and it is demoralizing. And it gets embedded in somebody's sense of self. They develop a deficit-oriented sense of self, a fixed mindset focused all on what is wrong, never what is right. And it is an imperative that we challenge that deficit model and we flip the script. You know, I know the power of that in my own life. You know, I'll never forget, I had this teacher in third grade named Mr. R. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Mr. R. Mr. R had a relentless, ferocious commitment to the idea that every single student, every single human being had something right with them. And he saw it as his job, forget job, his mission in life to find the good in every single student. So he would ask every kid every day, hey, what are you good at? 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 What do you like? And, you know, he'd ask me that question. And because I was only ever hearing what was wrong with me, I would say, Mr. R, I'm not good at anything, man. You know, nothing. But the thing about this guy is he never gave up. And one day he came to me and he said, hey, Jonathan, I've been watching you and you're wrong about yourself. You know, you are so good at telling stories. Now, sometimes the stories you tell are inappropriate stories, but I don't care. You are so good at telling stories that you could be a writer. I was 9 years old. Nobody had ever said anything like that to me before. I looked at him and said, Mr. R, a writer? Are you out of your goddamn mind? I can't spell, man. And the guy looked at me and he said, well, Jonathan, in my class, screw spelling. Screw spelling, man. Yeah, you should have seen me jump out of my body. Because for the first time in my life, somebody said, forget what you can't do and focus on what you can do. And that's your job, whoever you are, mom or dad, educator, human to other human beings. Your job is to find the good more than ever in our moment of crisis as a country. We need to find the good in the people around us. And we need to celebrate that good inside of them. And we need to draw it out, to name it, But more importantly, in education and beyond, we need to commit ourselves to building it. You know, if you're an at-risk young person like me, we don't build your strengths, we fix your problem. We got to reject that. And we got to dedicate our time and energy in building on the innate talents, interests, and capacities of every single young person we encounter. That's our work, to be a Mr. R for somebody else, ferociously committed to the idea that everybody has something right. Because a path to a thriving future is about finding a passion. It's about turning that passion into purpose. And then it's about turning that purpose into a pathway to a brighter future. Thriving isn't about fixing what's wrong with you. It's about finding and scaling and building on what is right. Okay, I want to conclude. And in concluding, I want to come back to what runs through my own journey, what runs through this work that we collectively are trying to do on behalf of the neurodiverse, and what makes it possible to empower young people who learn differently requires us to reject that idea that there is a normal. You know, that idea has been responsible for so much shame and suffering in the life of so many people. And it's imperative that we reject that idea, that we understand that it is our eccentricities, it is our weaknesses, it is our strengths, it's our gifts, it's our abilities, it's our disabilities, it is our differences that constitute our humanity. And it's imperative that all of us together fight for every single human being's right to be different. Okay. Thank you all so much for listening to me share my story. Thanks for those who are listening in a virtual context. Thanks for those who are here live tonight. And with that said, we have plenty of time now, about 20 minutes, to talk together. There are some pre-curated questions that came from registration that I'll take now, and then we'll turn it over to the chat, or if anyone is so emboldened, they can feel free to just ask a question in person. So with all that said and done, let me pass it over. But actually, one more thing. Sorry, I know it's a busy life everyone leads, and I'm so grateful for the time that you've taken already to be here. If you need to move on in your night, you know, no problem. Do your thing. But if you have a question that you want to ask and you don't get a chance to tonight, I want to share with you my email address. We'll put it in the chat. So if you need to move on, you can feel free to email me. My email is my name. It's Jonathan Mooney, JONATHANMOONEY, Jonathan Mooney at me.com. If you need to move on, I look forward to hearing from you. If you can stay, the floor is now, so to speak, yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Even though I'm moderating this, I want to rewatch it again because I think you made so many amazing points. So thank you. So we had a ton of questions from registration, and so we kind of smooshed them together a little bit. So I'm going to ask the first one, and then I'll turn it over to Greg. So we had several people who asked, this time that we're in right now is very not normal. This is a very strange kind of time to be alive and in education. So how do we support those kids that do live a little, quote, outside the lines during this time?
Yeah, look, you know, we are in uncharted waters. You know, I'm speaking to you from you know, my younger son's bedroom in Santa Monica, California. We've been doing remote distance learning now since March 15th of last year. So I'm living it both professionally and also personally. So let me just reflect on a few things that I think can help us weather this time as educators, as parents, as learners, and then I'll elevate up a little bit and reflect on you know, what I would aspire to moving forward in the future. Number one, look, I think one of the biggest mistakes we've made at times, districts, schools, not all, but many that I've encountered, is to take the old school curriculum and try to just beam it in new school pipes. And for so many young folks, it's just not working, young folks with neurodiversities and those without. And we need to be putting aside the dissemination of content right now, I think. And we need to be focused relentlessly on experiential learning opportunities that are grounded in young folks' strengths, interests, and talents. I think of my own children. My children go to a school that has taken upon itself to make personalized passion projects the through line for their education. And I have 3 kids, and having 3 kids is the best lesson in human diversity, because we have different children, like everyone who has multiple kids knows. And their passion projects are so different and so intriguing and so relevant to them. And building off of that platform of relevance, we can thread in, the core academic competencies. We can thread in the core academic content, but more importantly, we can maintain their sense of a joy for learning. And that's what I've really worried about and what I've seen lost. So for me, I think it's an opportunity for us to put content aside to focus on interests and threading and building learning journeys around that interest. Second thing I would say is, your child's, and frankly, your students' mental health has to be the priority right now. Before the pandemic, we were in the midst of a full-on youth well-being crisis. In 2018, suicide and self-harm became the second leading cause of death for young people ever in recorded history, only behind automobile accidents. That is a staggering statistic. And I was on a phone call earlier today with a university in which they've been tracking staggering self-harm rates and self-harm of students in their student body. So we have to prioritize that well-being. And if that means that we let the history grade slide, we let the history grade slide. Like we are in a unprecedented moment, and young folks are bearing the burden of a lot of the public policy shutdown that was required to get COVID under control. But young people have lost their schooling, they've lost their social circles, and we need to prioritize mental health and well-being. And I mean that both at the micro level of a parent relationship, teacher relationship, but I also mean it at the policy level. We need to be investing money in social emotional learning and healing as we come out of the other side of this for children. Third thing I would say, everyone, every human being, but certainly children, we learn from people who like us. Like, learning is a relationship-based act. It's not a technical act, and we have to commit ourselves to building that relationship. And more than ever, that's true to keep young folks engaged in this virtual format when they can just put their camera off and be on 5 different tabs on their computer. They have to feel connected to. So as an educator, any educators listening, we have to prioritize that connection. We have to know kids deeply, and we have to make a time and a commitment to that, to knowing young folks deeply. So with that said, at the sort of day-to-day level, let me elevate up a little bit higher. I think we have an opportunity, to emerge from this and reflect on this of what is truly authentic learning. And I think we know that it's not about content. It's about connection. It's not about remediating deficits. It's about scaling strengths. And it's not about a one-size-fits-all approach to education. It's about people finding a sense of purpose and passion in their education and building a learning journey around that. And if we can hold on to that and bring that back into the classroom, if we can evolve education around those core principles as a result of this unprecedented historical moment, I think young people will have a bright future. If we go back to doing the old school the same way, we'll be back to where we were. So that's a call to action for us not to miss this opportunity of change.
Jonathan, Greg here. This is so wonderful. Thank you again for doing this. I wanted to remind everybody, I know some of the people got on a little bit later. Amber has the links to Jonathan's 3 books in the chat, and I cannot recommend those books highly enough. I've read them and I love them, and that kind of leads to a question that I wanted to ask. We were joking a little bit about soccer before we got on. We're both kind of fancy ourselves soccer guys. Despite being a Tottenham fan, you are a soccer guy. I want to ask you, when you were a child, you wrote about in the short bus how, these aren't your words, mine, that soccer was somewhat of a salvation for you. It was an outlet. What advice do you give parents and educators on sort of children to diversify their having things like soccer and other things that are non-academic related in which they excel at?
Yeah. Well, I mean, your words were as good as mine. It was what researchers called an island of competency. If we look at the resiliency research, and resiliency broadly defined, whether that be folks who were challenged with learning, socioeconomic, structural racism, whatever that may be, folks who persevere in the face of those challenges have that island of competency, some place in their life where they're competent, where they're good, and where they're seen as good. And in my life, that was soccer. And I want to be very clear, not only was it a place where I felt good, but it became a way for me to survive. And it became a way for me to hold on hope for a bright future for myself. I only made it through high school because of soccer. I only aspired to college at first because of soccer. And if I'm frank with everyone, I only got into my first university before Brown, and I'll explain that in a second, because of soccer. I went on a Division I soccer scholarship to a school in Los Angeles. And that's what sort of kept me in the game, for lack of a better word. And without it, I really shudder to think how things might have turned out for me. So as it pertains to not me, but others, I think there's a couple lessons learned on that, which is we have to commit ourselves to making sure that every single young person has an island of competency in their life. And that doesn't have to be, you're going to be a professional soccer player now. It doesn't have to be, you're going to be a professional celloist. And in some ways, and you probably recall this from my own story with soccer, when we turn the island of competency into the thing now that's going to compensate for your deficits, then it gets compromised as a true experience of joy and flow. I ended up really ultimately feeling that soccer was something that people liked about me because I was good, not because they liked me. So that was its own sort of challenge. So we have to find and create space for those islands of competency, whatever they may be. And we have to value them as ends and goods in and of themselves, regardless of whether or not they have any sort of professional or academic pathway. The other thing that we need to do, and I do write about this as it pertains to soccer, is soccer wasn't just a place in which I was good at it, and so I wasn't just somebody with a problem. It was also something I was smart at, and I had a couple, and that's an important distinction, because you'll recall in my presentation I talked about how we have such a narrow definition of what constitutes intelligence. And we only name certain things as intelligence, and those are mostly academic things. But I had a bunch of soccer coaches who talked about being an intelligent soccer player. And that is so true. I mean, you know how many young folks on football teams, especially Black and brown young folks who see this as an opportunity, they're called stupid in school, and then they go out to the football practice and they've memorized a playbook this thick. Is that kid stupid? I don't think so. They have a different way of learning. So we often find in islands of competency a way to surface and name a form of intelligence that has been ignored or devalued in traditional school. So I encourage parents and teachers to not just find that island of competence, but also to use it as a chance to reframe what it means to be smart and to really be clear about that. And then the third thing I would say is we have to really make time in the day for these things. You know, I think we've gotten a little good at you know, the idea that we're all different. You know, kids show up to school in kindergarten and they're told that they're special snowflakes, right? Well, we're all different. We're all special snowflakes. And then the bell rings and it turns into, now sit your special snowflake ass down and get ready for the standardized test, you know? So our rhetoric and our reality doesn't match. And often our rhetoric and our time doesn't match. If we really believe in social emotional learning, if we really believe in a system where everyone has a spark of genius, then we need to make time to cultivate that in kids' days. And not just after school, but in the school day. And we certainly need to make sure that we don't have policies that take away the island of competency from kids. Let me give you some examples of that. You know, under No Child Left Behind, when a public school was deemed a quote unquote failing school, the first thing that public school would lose was all of its after school programming, robotics, acting, drama, sports, all the things that kids cared about, we took away. You know, when a young person is struggling in school, their GPA falls below a certain level, one of the first things they lose is sports in public school by public school policy. And that is wrong. So we need to cultivate that island of competency, use it as a chance to reframe intelligence, and then we need to preserve that island, build a big old moat around it where kids have access to it in their day and our policies don't take it away.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I totally agree with the islands of competencies idea that we can't take those away from kids. So I had a question come up in the chat that Hillary asked, and I think that this is a really interesting question. My younger daughter is an atypical learner with limited interests. How can I help her expand her interests and try new activities, new hobbies, different things?
Yeah, well, hey, Hillary, I really appreciate that question. It's a challenge that I think many twice exceptional atypical learners, young children and adults for that matter, find themselves in. I don't know, Hillary, how old your daughter is, but I can tell you that the origin of that challenge is not innate. I'm sure, as is almost uniformly the case when your daughter was young, they were interested in all sorts of things. So that means it's learned behavior. And that learned behavior comes a lot from that special snowflake dynamic that I just talked about. So let's name that problem, first of all. Let's understand that that's something somebody learned as a result of a set of systems and cultural norms that tells people what they should like, opposed to letting people discover what they really like. So with that problem named, I know that doesn't solve it in the short term. So what does? Well, a couple things. You know, a lot of young folks who have become disconnected from their sense of passion and interest, they have strengths, but their strength is often being misapplied, you know, quote unquote misapplied. And no one's ever really seeing those as strengths. You know, I'll give you, a good example of that, right? You know, I used to make a lot of jokes in class, most often at the teacher's expense. And I would get in trouble for that, right? All the time, you know, and I'm not alone in that. So I never thought of myself as somebody who could be funny. I thought of myself as somebody who was bad. You know, I'll tell you a story about that personal transformation, not in my life, but in somebody else's life. So I do a lot of talks. And back in the day, I gave a talk in Massachusetts. And I told this story about how I used to hide in the bathroom to escape reading out loud. And then after my talk, this old school teacher, she's 80 years old, she came up to me and she said, hey, I really appreciated your talk, but I really appreciated that story of reading out loud because it reminded me of one of my students. And she told me about this young boy who every single time during reading out loud, he would make a joke to get kicked out on purpose because he was embarrassed about reading. And she realized that that's why he was doing it, listening to me talk. Do you know who that little boy was? That little boy was Jay Leno, who is a famous dyslexic. So often these strengths get misapplied in that culture of the special snowflake. So I'd ask you to reflect on, what's the thing that you keep hearing that's kind of negative about your daughter? Maybe she hears, oh, she talks too much. Oh, she's too social. Oh, she draws, she daydreams. All of these things that we frame as bad are actually good. So let's reframe those, right? Now, what about exposing to interests? So I've been wrestling with that for 20 years. I've been on a mission to reframe education away from deficit to strength. And recently, I joined a social venture that's trying to find a way to help parents do that. And it's called Thrively. It's like the word thrive, L-Y. And it has a strength and interest assessment for parents and their children that's free of cost. And then once it's surfaced those strengths and interests, it starts to do exposure to potential pathways and other areas of interest that are strength aligned. So I just saw it in the chat. It's thrively.com. I hope it's a meaningful tool. I know it's been a meaningful tool in my family and many families around the country. A tool that helps us get away from that special snowflake hypocrisy and really honor the interests of young people, and more importantly, help them build a journey around those interests and talents. So check that out, and hopefully it's helpful to you.
Awesome. So we are pretty close to the end, but I think we've got time for one more question from somebody who's here. If you want me to read it, I'll be happy to read it from the chat. So I'll let you guys pop in. Yeah. So I saw Alvarez first. Carrie, if you want to put your question in the chat, I'll ask it as well.
So thanks, Jonathan. That was awesome. Thank you for just putting yourself out there and sharing everything. And by the way, I'm a Tottenham fan too. So we all suffer a big degree of misery and probably a lesson in SEL, just being a Tottenham fan. But anyways, I actually helped co-found a charter school in the South Bronx 5 years ago. Right from the very beginning, we had all the research on social emotional learning. We've integrated it along with competency-based learning approach, as well as with restorative justice. Trying to be innovative. It's a charter school. And, I'm the chairman of the board. And what I've noticed is that as we built in all these ancillary services, we've just scaled up the number of people in the building. So we've got therapists, we've got mental health workers, we've got the guidance counselors, we've got the youth workers, we've got the community advocates. And it's almost to a degree where our budget is so heavily dependent on just people being there and being around the kids in the building. And I'm just curious, if you've seen this kind of issue before, where just schools are overpopulating themselves with trying to tackle the SEL issues, while at the same time, programs that kind of help to just make things more efficient. I appreciate when you say integrated in the curriculum, integrated every day. We do. We integrate it throughout the week. We have gender groups missing, but there's a lot of people.
Yeah.
And I fear that is just someone who has fiscal responsibility in a recession, that we might just be harming ourselves in the long run. So just curious if you have any advice on this, or just anything. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, being a Tottenham fan is a lesson in resiliency, and well, it's going to be this year. I promise you, it's happening. I feel it. We're on the top of the table for what, like 1 week?
That's right.
But not far off. So, and on a more serious note, I so appreciate your service, because it is service, I mean, like, and everybody on this call, the hosts of tonight, the educators out there, this is capital P, capital S public service on behalf of trying to heal the world and make for a better future for us. So thank you for that. So let me reflect on a couple of things that you said. First of all, I want to give you a big old shout out for that focus on competency-based learning. I won't assume that everyone on this call is as well steeped and infected by educational jargon like you and I. But if y'all don't know competency-based learning, you should check it out. It's an easy Google. It is probably one of the most subtle and at the same time radical evolutions of learning that I advocate for when it comes to changing the environment, not the kid, because it fundamentally reorients how we think about outcomes, away from grades, command and control, away from seat time, right? How long a young person sits in a class, a Carnegie unit, et cetera, to whether or not they're mastering a set of competencies. And the most robust competency-based schools and initiatives are broadening our definition of competency, right? Away from those narrow academic skills to a broader set of skills that really lead and correlate with human flourishing and contribution to society. So amen on that. And I'm so inspired by it. I hope you put in the chat the name of your school so I can celebrate it around in my travels. So now to your question. Look, a couple things. And I don't, they're going to be affirming, but I don't think they'll be reassuring to you, and on the affirming side of things, look, educating human beings is an expensive and time consuming endeavor that we as a society have never fully funded. That's just the bottom line. We have never invested what we need to invest in young people. We haven't. Both as it pertains to educational funding, but then as it pertains to public policy around paternal and maternal leave, around child poverty, around child health care. You all are swimming upstream against a system that does not invest in children. And that's to say that we should be advocates for a child agenda, broadly defined, not just an education agenda, but a child agenda that invests in families, invests in neighborhoods, invests in the health of families and neighborhoods. That's what our work should be about. So if you found a way to scrape together and to thread that needle to get all those folks in that room doing right by young folks, I know that is fiscally taxing and anxiety producing, but it's probably what it takes to do the work that you're doing in the communities that you're doing it. And we need to find more ways to fund that work. Now, let me give you one potential strategy around that, more ways to fund our work. There is a emerging coalition of traditional public schools, charter schools, and charter schools that are using what have historically been categorical special education funding to fund universal design and services. And that is a revolution, because for too long we've said, this money goes over here for these young folks. But imagine if we were team teaching with the same teacher, right? Imagine if we were providing literacy with the same teacher to more groups of kids. This idea of fully funding the Individuals with Disability Education Act, with no Congress has ever done, the Biden administration is very serious about, and with the full funding, allowing schools to use those to meet the diverse needs of more and more types of students. So if you're interested in learning more about the coalition of people on the ground, CFOs of major districts who have figured out a way to use those resources to create the type of wraparound support that you've articulated. I'm happy to do some introductions later. My email's in the chat, and I hope you'll reach out personally.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Well, hey, everybody. Thank you all so much. I know I've kept you a little longer than was originally calendared. I'm going to pass it off to the hosts, but I do want to just say again, please feel free to reach out via my email. I'm still on that mission of doing presentations free of cost to anybody who asks. I'm on number 50, and I'll do 250 as long as there's folks out there who are committed to this work. I'll be there to support and amplify the work that you're doing. So reach out via my email or find me on social. I want to thank the hosts tonight, who are those people doing right by all young folks out there, capital P, capital S, public service that they're doing. And I'm honored to be a small part of their work. Let me turn it back to them to take us off for the evening.
Jonathan, thank you so much. And I just really, I want to thank, I know we have people from all over the world on this right now, and it's just means a lot to all of us. Everything that you do, Jonathan, your life purpose and your calling and your great work in this field, and can't thank you enough. And again, everybody, check out his books and his website. Amber?
Yeah, so thank you so much. This was fantastic, and we are so honored to have you here, and also to help us kick off this whole series of speakers too, that we're hoping can create a community of, like you said, just trying to help kids, try to help fix education, and make life better for people, I think is a key for us. So real quickly, I just want to reiterate that we will send out the recording. I'm going to tell everybody by Friday. In reality, it'll probably be tomorrow, but I'm going to tell you Friday. So we'll send the recording out. With the recording, I'll also include links to the books, to our upcoming speakers, all of the links that we shared here today. I just really quickly do want to share my screen and show you who we've got coming up. So you can go ahead and mark your calendars. I'll send this in the email as well, but we're going to have a speaker in February, March, April, and May, and then we'll start back up with the school year. So we've got sessions on social media and mindfulness, building resiliency. We've got self-care for parents. We've got movement for the body and the brain. So all of these are going to be at our SEL page, where we've also got resources. There are a ton of free videos and links and books and resources there as well. You can also email Greg or I anytime. We're happy to take speaker suggestions, topic suggestions, anything. So, Jonathan, thank you so much for being here. And thank you everyone for joining us and learning with us tonight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Bye, everybody.
Have a great night. Bye.